listening to a Monastery podcast. I'm Harley Matthews, and I host this podcast as a space that exists to intersect theology, religious history, and culture, all with a bend toward the heavy. I want to thank you for listening. I encourage you to take the time to share, comment, and like this podcast, and to be notified of future episodes. All right, friends, let's get into it. So, I wanted to start out with the obvious question of why monastery. So, a little bit of my own background. I'm MDiv, which is a Master's of Divinity student, as well as a Master's of Arts and Religion student in Louisville. I'm originally from Texas, um, and I study most specifically the life and work and influence of a mystic, monk, artist, poet, Thomas Merton. But I also spent a lot of time around the punk and hardcore scene in various cities and places, and I've always thought there was more to say about that. And a few years before I came to Louisville, I spent some time at a silent retreat and took some spiritual direction, which is basically having conversations with somebody about where you're at. And I had mentioned that I really wanted. I don't know why I couldn't get into the silence. It was hard for me, and I wasn't sure if I could do it. And the person that I was sitting with said, "Well, it sounds like you find the same thing. You find this contemplation, this inner listening at hardcore shows. It seems like in the loudest of places where many people would avoid, you're able to center and find that space in." So I took that to heart. I started thinking about it, and part of developing this podcast has been really asking that very specific question of, are there other people like me? Are there realities of what happens at a punk show, what happens at a hardcore show is contemplative. And so we're going to explore that in this kind of first season or first set of episodes. But why monastery? So monastery doesn't sound very punk, definitely doesn't sound very hardcore. But a monastery essentially is a place to experience, a place to encounter. And I spent so much of my life learning more about serving the poor, learning more about solidarity with the oppressed at shows where some member of the band had a zine, and I learned about what was happening locally. I learned about what was happening in the city that I lived in. I remember going to Food Not Bombs and eating vegetarian food with my friends and with people I've never met before. I remember being a participant of those because I didn't have any food to eat. So both sides of that, right? The serving side and the receiving side. And I learned more about that. I learned about real actual dignity from punk bands that put on shows in South Texas, and the way you got in was 2 or 3 canned food items. And those canned food items, sometimes they went to food shelters and banks and all these things, but sometimes they went into our bellies. Sometimes there was free vegan chili. Sometimes there was all sorts of things, and I see that happening now. I was just at a cafe recently. If you follow me on Instagram or Facebook, you saw this post, and I made a quick reflection of I saw a flyer for a show. Shout out Split Intentions. They're a newer band here in Louisville. Amazing, amazing hardcore band, and they had a show with a bunch of other folks coming down. And right on the bottom of that little flyer said hashtag free vegan chili, and it's that kind of thing. But I think there is as an important element of when Thomas Merton talked about the role of the monk. One of the things that he mentioned that I think is relevant here is the monk doesn't leave the world. The monk takes time away from society to pray for society, to think about society, so that when the monk goes back into society, there's a clarity and a value to what's being said. And I think there's some clear intersections of being marginalized. Um, uh, there is and always will be, it seems, a scene. So when I use the word scene, right, there's a localized community of people thinking about what the needs are for them, what the needs are for the people around them, who's getting messed with, who's getting abused, and how can they come in solidarity with those people and make change. That feels monastic to me. So this podcast is going to have these conversations. And so I hope that makes sense. I hope check me on this, please. I'm really interested in this becoming less of a you listening to me and more of a dialogue. The way you can do that, you can email me monasterypod@gmail.com. You can reach out to me on social media. I'm Harley Matthews. I have my own account, but also some things that are directly attached to that. Patreon. If you go to Patreon Monastery Podcast, you're going to find me there. I also have a website. It's harleydeanmatthews.weebly.com. You're going to see a lot of the school stuff that I do, but that's another way you can contact me. But even in this video, if you jump in the comment section, let's talk about it. Maybe you don't see the intersection of faith and hardcore. Maybe it's too different for you. But I really do want to have the dialogue, and I'm interested in what value it might have for us to consider those scenes, consider our local scenes as places to organize, places to really let and lash out and be fully present, to be fully engaged in this deep listening of the community, and then going out into the world outside of that and being activated and being active in that. So thanks for jumping in. Thanks for thinking about things with me. If you are interested in more dialogue, there's going to be future episodes. I'm hoping to do some interviews and some conversations with folks that directly intersect Merton in their conversation. And then the next thing we're going to talk about, you'll see a podcast pretty soon here about why Thomas Merton. What's some more specifics about his own life. So it's a short one, just a little bit about why I named it this. There's more to it, but that's some things to think on. All right, friends, I'll end it the way I'd like to. All grace, all the way, and we'll talk soon. You have been listening to a Monastery podcast. I'm Harley Matthews, and I want to remind you that this space exists to intersect theology, religious history, and culture, all with a bend toward the heavy. Thank you for listening. Take the time to share, comment, like this post, and then get involved with future episodes. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your ideas and thoughts for future episodes. If you've got questions, if you've thought of contemplation in a way that intersects with the heavy, let me know. Let's talk about it. The music you're hearing behind the intro-outro of this episode was gifted to us by the band Miriam and unreleased tracks from the album Visitors. So I want to thank them. You can find more about them in the show notes below.